Good morning. Suppose we have a circuit like this and we are asked to calculate the current in the branches. First of all, we need to calculate the equivalent resistance. With the equivalent resistance we can calculate the main current, I1. And once we have I1, we will use the current divider method to calculate I4, I6 and I2. I will explain the method. I will draw the circuit again differently to see it clearly. This is R1, this is R2, this is R3, R6, we can draw it like this to see that it's in parallel with R2, and here we have R4 and R5 are in series, and here we call it I4, which is equal to I5, this is I6, this is I2, and this is I1. So let's calculate first, and then I will explain the current divider method. We can extend it to 3 or 4 branches. What I can say that the resistance, the equivalent resistance, these are first step R1 and R5 are in series. They are later in parallel with R6. Third step, R2 is in parallel with these 3, and we add R1 and R3 to calculate the equivalent resistance, and this is the fourth step. Let's call this one R1 prime. This is R4 plus R5, it's equal to 50 plus 250 is 300 ohms. R2 prime, R1 prime in parallel with R6. This is R1 prime times R6 over R1 prime plus R6. This is 300 times R6, which is 100 over 400, and it's 75 ohms. Later, R2 prime, R3 prime is equal R2 prime in parallel with R2, and this is R2 times R2 prime over R2 plus R2 prime, and it's equal to 75 times R2, which is 300 over 375, and this is 60 ohms. And now the equivalent resistance is R3 prime plus R1 plus R3, and it's 60 plus R1, which is 100 plus 140, and it's 300 ohms. Now we can calculate I1 is equal to V over RE is equal to 300 over 300, and it's 1 amps. Let's write the result. I1 is 1 amp. R1 prime is 300 ohms. R2 prime 75 ohms. R3 prime 60 ohms. I think we might not need all this. Let's explain now the current divider method. I used it before, but we can use it for 3 resistors in parallel. First of all, we can say that if we have 2 resistors in parallel, and if we had to calculate I1 and I2 in function of the main current I, remember that the equivalent resistance of 2 resistors in parallel, this is R1, R2 over R1 plus R2. V, voltage here, is R equivalent times the main current, which is equal R1, R2 over R1 plus R2 times the main current. Now I1 is equal to V over R1. If we replace V by this value, it means that I1 is R2 over R1 plus R2 times the main current. And I2, we do the same. This is R1 over R1 plus R2 times I. And now if we can extend this to three resistors in parallel, what we are going to use here. This is I3. This is the case. So the equivalent resistance, we can write this formula. It's easy to prove it, but I'm not going to do it. I did it before. R1 R2 R3 over R1 R2 plus R2 R3 plus R3 R1. Voltage is equal to this times I, the main current. Times the main current. And here we can calculate I1, same thing. We see that I1 is V over R1. The R1 disappears, so we have R2, R3 times the sum of the RR times I. I2, R2 disappears, R1, R3 over the sum of RR times the main current, and I3 is R1, R2 over the sum times the main current. So we're going to use these formulas. They're not complicated. Here the main current is I1, this one R2, R6, and this one R1 prime, which I've written here. So we can say that I2, I6, and I4. Okay. Sum of the RR, I'll write it here, is one R2, R6 plus R6, R1 prime plus R1 prime times R2. And this is, R2 is 300 times R600 plus 100 times 300 plus 300 times 300, and this is 150,000 ohm squared. Okay. Now I will write the formula here. I2 is R6 times R1 prime. I6 is R2 times R1 prime times the main current, which is I1. Sorry to forget this one. This is, I had to do the film again because I forgot. I1, I4 is R2, R6 over the sum of the R times I1, which is equal to 1. Let's calculate R6, R1 prime is equal R6. R6 is 100, R1 prime is 300, so this is 30,000 ohm squared. This will disappear by dividing, and we are left with amps. R2, R1 prime, R2 is 300 times 300, and it's 90,000 ohm squared. R2, R6 is 100 times 300, and it's 30,000 ohm squared. So we replace here everything. R2 is R6, R1 prime is 30,000 over 150,000 times 1. I'm not going to write it, 0.2 amps. Here R2, R1 prime, 90,000 over 150,000 times 1, and this is 0.6 amp. Here it's 30,000 over 150,000 times 1. I'm not going to write it, and this is 0.2 amps. Let's check whether this is 0.2. I forgot to write points here. Point. Okay, 0.2, 0.6, here 0.8, and here 0.2. Is it correct? 0.2 plus 0.6, it's 0.8. 0.8 plus 0.2 will make 1 amp. And that's it. And thank you very much.